Hello, welcome to Converging Dialogues. This is Xavier Bonilla. On this episode, I am talking with Dominic J. Packer. Dominic is a professor of psychology at Lehigh University and the associate dean for research and graduate programs in arts and sciences, where he oversees 12 graduate programs in 18 academic departments. Much of his research investigates groups. He's a social psychologist, so he's looking about how people decide to dissent from their groups as well as to cooperate with members of other groups. He's a popular teacher. He teaches a wide range of courses, and he is the author of the new book, The Power of Us, Harnessing Our Shared Identities to Improve Performance, Increase Cooperation, and Promote Social Harmony with Jay Van Bavel. They're colleagues for a long time, and they have written a fantastic book, which is what we talk about in this episode. We start by talking about why they wrote the book concerning group identities. We talk about how they define identities and why they're important. We talk about how to delineate between the self and personality. There's many ideas that people will have about the self. Is there a unified self or the different types of self? We talk a little bit about that. We talk about pro-selves versus pro-socials. We talk about in-group versus out-group. We talk about cooperation with group identities. We briefly mentioned the replication crisis, and he gives some of his views on some of the classic social psych experiments. We talk about group identity with political polarization, optimal distinctiveness. We talk about dissent, and then we end by talking about healthy group identities. Dominic is a very, very nice person, and he was wonderful in this conversation. I think a lot of the times we, myself included, become very disillusioned with groups. We don't want to be a part of a group. And that might make sense for some things, such as a particular ideology or particular political persuasion. But, our social psychology tells us that we as humans are social mammals. We are groupish, and we do make group identities often about in many different ways. And we have to find a way to have healthy group identities where we don't overemphasize our group, but that we don't also under or emphasize it or de-emphasize it. And both Jay and Dominic do a very nice job in their book, trying to explain the different facets of group identities, and then how we can have really healthy group identities for all of us in society. So now I bring you Dominic Packer. I'm here with Dominic Packer. Dominic, thank you so much for coming on the podcast and being willing to talk with me about your work and your research and your new book. So I appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah. So you have a new book out with your co-author, Jay Van Bavel. I never really realized how he has like the JJ is spelled out the first name and the middle initial.
JJ.
And you also have the J in the middle name. So you and Van Bavel wrote the book, The Power of Us, Harnessing Our Shared Identities to Improve Performance, Increase Cooperation, and Promote Social Harmony. Yeah, it's great. It's a great book.
Well, thank you. Thank you. Appreciate it.
I did enjoy it. So maybe just tell listeners who you are,
Sure.
what the work is that you're doing, and how you and Jay came to kind of write the book together.
Sure. So I am a social psychologist and a professor at Lehigh University, which is in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. And Jay and I have known each other now for almost 20 years. We met in graduate school at the University of Toronto, where we shared the same sub-basement office. It was in the basement below the basement of the building. Not a glamorous space, but we got to know each other there. And after an early rocky start to our relationship, we formed a pretty close bond because we're fundamentally interested in the same sorts of issues, which are how do the groups that people belong to shape and influence their identities and thereby affect really everything from the way they perceive the world, how they make sense of other people, even potentially things like taste and smell, up through processes about like intergroup relations and bias. And from there, can influence leadership and social protest and large scale social change. So we're really interested in, and this is what we talk about in the book, the influence that identities have on people's thoughts and their feelings and their beliefs and the way they make decisions, all the way from pretty low level things in day-to-day life, all the way up through larger scale social processes.
Yeah. I think that's wonderful, and obviously I think it's salient for many periods of time, but I think it's, obviously salient for us currently in our current moment in society.
Right.
I guess just specifically, how did it come about to do the book? So you guys have done work together, you've done research together. Right. Writing a book is a process. It's a lot of work, and writing it together. Sure. And I'm sure some of this was written during the pandemic. And how did you guys decide to write a book about some of this stuff?
Yeah, I mean, the inception was probably about 5 years ago now. So at the time, I was in a book club in the community I live in, and we'd meet once a month or so, and read usually a mix of nonfiction and fiction, often sort of go back and forth. And I made a recommendation of a nonfiction social science book. I won't say what book it was, that had come out around the time. And our book club read it, and then we met, and they all hated it. They all trashed it, spent an awkward hour together. Fortunately, there was some wine, but everyone's whining about the book. And it was written by someone I and Jay, and probably you have an acquaintance with. This is not to knock the book or the person. I thought it was fine. But I mentioned this story to Jay next time I saw him. I was telling him the story. And he said, well, come on, at least this person wrote a book. Like, we couldn't do that. And I said, sure, we could. We could write a book. And he's like, well, about what? And I said, well, what we study, we should write a book about social identity. And that got us thinking, and that was about 5 years ago. And so we sort of ruminated about it and talked about it every once in a while for a period of time. And then we ended up writing a proposal and pitching it and finding an agent and so on. And then we really buckled down and started writing it, as you said, during the pandemic, which was not ideal, not the best time to write a book. We both were sort of locked in our respective homes with our little kids, and we joke that it's really a book written by 10,000 text messages, because that turned out to just be the most efficient way to communicate.
Yeah, I it's interesting seeing, and I remember when the pandemic first hit, I was like, I just feel like we're going to get a lot of content. We're going to get a lot of books. We're going to get a lot of music. Bands are going to be putting double albums out. And I think we're seeing some of that for sure. I think that on the music side and on the writing side. And so it has been interesting reading some of the books that are coming out now. And there's usually somewhere in there reference to, COVID-19, what implications their book has on, the past year. So that's been interesting kind of seeing that as well. I wonder how long that carries through, but very, very interesting though, about how, there's an element of you have a lot of time, but at the same time, not, especially if you have family and things like that. So,
yeah, exactly.
Okay, so getting into the book, I think we'll talk about a lot of things. So obviously, you guys are in the world of social psychology. I've had a handful of social psychologists on the podcast previously.
Right.
I love you guys. You guys are a fun bunch of psychology. You do all the research side of things. So, and so obviously that's going to be, kind of the grid or angle you guys, you're coming from. But I guess the first question I want to start with is this idea of identity, and how do we define, or how do you guys define individual identity and group identity, right? And so I think social psychologists mostly look at all the groupish nature of humans. So group identity is probably the majority of the focus in the book, but just how do we understand identity and then parse that out from individual identity and group identity?
Sure. I mean, I think we take a pretty simplistic approach to thinking about what identity is, which is how people make sense of themselves. It's who do you think you are? And if you think you are something, and especially if you say it's a valued part of yourself, then we would consider that part of your identity. One of the things we discussed earlier in the book is a thing called the 20 statements test, which psychologists sometimes use to get a sense of what is your identity, and essentially to ask somebody to complete the phrase, I am blank 20 times. And what's interesting about that task is if you try it, it's actually really easy to do. For most of us, we can come up with 20 things that we find self-defining in a matter of, a minute and a half, and it's not that hard, which illustrates we have a multifaceted self, right? Because when you look at your list, what you'll usually discover is there'll be things on there that are very much individual. So things you would consider to characterize yourself as a person that make you different from other individuals. These might be personality traits, right? So you could say, I'm a very conscientious person, or I'm really smart. And you're referring to yourself as an individual and in some ways different from other people you might know. Other things on your list will almost certainly be relationships you have, or relational identities. Right. So self as child or father, or self as student or professor. Right? These are roles or relationships where you're defined in relation to somebody else. But also on these lists, for most of us at least, you're going to find collective identities. These are identities based in the groups you belong to. It can be everything from family-based groups through citizenship in a nation, to fan of a sports team, to your occupational identity, to volunteer organization you're part of. And it's not like every group you're in becomes a part of your identity or is really important to you, but some of the groups you're in almost certainly do. And when that happens, you become interested in their interests, and you start to feel an emotional attachment, and you start to like the members of that group, potentially more than the members of other groups, and so on. So the individual collective distinction is it something that's defining me as an individual as different from other individuals, or is it something that's founded in a group, there's a category, and there's a whole bunch of us in it, and that's becoming an important part of who I think I am as well.
Yeah, no, that's a very nice delineation between the two. My question about that is that why do you think that's, I mean, we're social mammals, right? So there's you would probably make an evolutionary argument that there's something inherent about how we understand our pull to identify with a group, right? But is there any other kinds of hypotheses or reasons of, why does it feel like we must be a part of a group, or how we identify has to be part of some kind of, identity or collective or things like that? Because, what if you would say, well, I don't belong to a group. We don't really, we have certain ideas about like the loners of society, or people that are very insulated, and so I think most of the time people talk about that negatively, for better or for worse, whatever value someone wants to put on it. But it seems like we place in essence, a sort of value of this is who I'm a part of, or who I'm not a part of, or, this is how I see myself. Is there some bigger importance to that, or in terms of finding our place in the world, or something else?
Well, I think, so for most people, there is something important about it. Most people certainly seem to have this propensity to, once they're in a category, to start to identify with it. And so much so that you can do this in the lab, right? You can flip a coin and say, you're on team A and you're on team B. And the people on team A start to feel like, oh, team A is awesome. And they'll even discriminate if they're dividing up rewards in favor of their team. It's just like we have this readiness to do that. Yeah. Now, that said, I think not everyone necessarily does that as strongly. And there is actually some recent research, a recent paper came out suggesting that the kinds of people who identify strongly with one group, it's quite likely they will also identify strongly with other groups, right? That there might be stronger identifiers out there, and that for other people, they might be less prone to that. And I certainly think that's a possibility. But nevertheless, I think the reason we do this is, as you say, probably grounded in our evolutionary heritage. Human beings are a very fragile species, right? We don't have scales or prickly things that come out of our skin to protect us. We're not poisonous. We're probably quite delicious, really. So the way we've survived is usually with other people, right? And for that reason, I think we have a propensity or a set of needs or motives to seek out affiliative opportunities with others. both in relationships, but also in group contexts. And you can think about why that might be beneficial, because as groups, you can often accomplish things that as an individual, you cannot accomplish on your own. And so for me, I think this readiness to groupie is as if we're always on the lookout for cooperative opportunities. It's usually how I say it, is that we're looking at, as we walk around the world, we're looking for opportunities where we could work or affiliate with somebody else for some mutual benefit. And the psychology of that, or the phenomenology of that, what that feels like, is felt as an identity. It's felt as, oh, this is part of who I am right now. And some of them become chronic, lifelong, and some of them come and go, right? You're part of a team for a month, you move work unit to become part of a different team, and your identity will shift accordingly.
Yeah, that's something that you talk about early in the book, and I wanted to ask you, because I wasn't sure I entirely agreed with the next point of kind of about that. Was you mentioned early on that that each individual has what you call shifting selves, and even discuss the pro selves and the pro socials. I guess my question is, are there not elements of personality and or temperament that are static, that they don't change? Sure. If you kind of think of like, there's a core of us that does not have a shifting self. So I guess, what do you mean when you say that the self is a ever changing or ever evolving kind of thing?
So I think this is a really great question. And we were talking before the show, I and Jay have done a lot of podcasts lately, and you're the first person to ask this question. Oh. And I think it's a really good one, which is, what's the difference between personality and the self? So to me, the way I think about it is that personality is, as you said, temperament. It is relatively stable patterns that people exhibit in the way they feel emotions and the way they behave and interact with the world. So to be conscientious is to have a relatively stable pattern of fairly organized and careful and deliberative and dependable behavior. To be extroverted is to have a relatively stable pattern of seeking social engagement with others, and so on. But that's not the self. It can be the self, in the sense that you can come to think of yourself as, I am an extroverted person. That could become a part of your identity, where it matters to you, right? You define yourself as, I'm extroverted. It would be on your list of 20 statements. But there are probably other aspects of your personality, in the sense that they are relatively stable things that you do, that you don't think of as self-defining. It's just not that important to you. So maybe conscientiousness. Maybe you are a pretty conscientious person, but it's not on your list of 20 things. It's just not something you think about with regard to yourself, even though it actually does characterize you. Other people might notice it. It might show up on a questionnaire. If you do the Big 5 personality inventory, you'll score high on that. Doesn't mean it's part of your identity, though it could be, right? And so I think when we're talking about identities, we're talking about the things you find as self-defining. And basically the idea is that someone with a certain type of personality could shift between those different identities. And it's not like their personality is going to radically change. So a conscientious person in one group is probably also going to be a conscientious person in another group. But those two group identities could be different, right? So the way they behave at work with their occupational identity is not the same as the way they behave at the Rotary Club, that they go to after work. But they might be fairly conscientious in terms of their personality in both locations. And then there's one further twist to that, which is that when it's an identity, especially a collective identity, what you often find, especially if it's a valued one, is people conform to the norms of that group. And that's where I think you can see people behave in ways that might actually be a bit different than their typical personality, right? So you could take somebody who's fairly introverted day to day. In most situations, they're an introverted person, but in some contexts, right? Let's say they're an ardent fan of a soccer team, and they go to a match and their team wins the match. They may well behave in a very extroverted fashion in that context, because that's the norm, right? Like everyone's super excited and outgoing, and they're hugging each other and shouting. And, in that context, even an introvert could look like an extrovert. So to me, that's the interplay. I believe personality is a real thing. We have these stable patterns. They can be part of your identity. But you can also have selves that can cause you through norms to behave in ways that might be a little counter to your personality at times.
Well, it's all very complicated, right?
Sure.
Okay, so let me try and see if I can make sense of some of what you said. So I think we both agree that there are certain things about our personality, or if you will, temperament, that is pretty it's very unlikely to change over time, barring some major traumas or something like that, maybe, or brain tumor, whatever. There's exceptions, I guess, but more often than not, that's pretty stable. There are some folks that will posit that the self is sort of an illusion. So this idea of what we understand about the self doesn't really exist. I'll tease this out a little bit. So, I think most people, when they think of me, or the I, or the ego, or, the self is this idea of, kind of somebody riding in the cockpit of the plane, or someone's driving the vehicle. Like there's somebody inside of me that's, maneuvering everything, right? My thoughts, my feelings, my desires, my intuitions, my physical body, right? And as far as we know, based on the wide interdisciplinary data we have, that doesn't exist. There's nobody in the driver's seat necessarily, right? If you take one of the some of the theorists, the old psychology theorists. So the big one is Carl Rogers. I'm not a Rogerian clinician. There's some tenets and principles that are fine, but his idea of the self was actually pretty interesting, which was this idea of that you want to have a coherent self, an integrated self, which has some borrowing from Gestalt therapy and psychology. That we have different parts of who we are, right, or different selves, right, but that the total conglomeration of all that makes us who we are, that makes ourselves. And so I wonder if some of this stuff of what you're saying, because you're talking about the ideas of different ways in which we identify, right, that kind of that list, is aspects of how we see ourselves, right? That we could be in one context, but we don't necessarily see ourselves in a certain way, but that is a part of what makes us who we are, if you will. And so the self is this kind of composite of all of these different ways and different interactions, and if you will, identities that make us who we are. And I don't know if maybe at a certain point, this stuff, I typically hate discussions on defining terms, but I do wonder if this is just kind of people saying the same kinds of things, just using different terminology for things. But what do you think about this idea of, yes, there's no interior self, that's driving the ship. Just all the parts of who we are make the self, and that there could be a composite of all these different identities. And the thread that runs through that keeps it stable is some element of one's personality. Does that framework sit with you well, or you disagree there?
Sure. I mean, I think, the way we would normally talk about it is that people possess multiple selves, that these different identities you have. So who I am as a father versus who I am as a professor versus who I am as a Canadian versus who I am as a colleague of Jay, right? These are all slightly different selves. They, especially to the extent they're groups, they have different norms associated with them. And as they come in and out of focus, and this is a key premise in the book, it can change your perceptions in that moment, or it can change the way in which you make decisions. And I think most importantly, it actually can change your motivations. So that when you're acting in terms of a particular identity, you're striving to do well by that identity. Like, what are our goals here? And it could be an individual level self, in which case you might be trying to maximize personal self-interest, but it could be a collective self, in which you might be trying to maximize the group's interest in that moment. But it's sort of a semantic debate, because you could just say, well, that whole cluster of things is the self. And I think I'm totally fine with saying that. That again, if you get people to list 20 things they find self-defining, you could say, well, that whole set is for that person themselves. But the point we're trying to make is that different pieces of that entirety will be in focus at different times. And although the driver's seat may largely be an illusion, it still nevertheless feels like we live life in a self-authored way. There is somebody in the driver's seat, whether that's true or false. And exactly who that is and who that feels like in a given moment can be different for different for the same person at different times.
Yeah, I think I mostly agree with you there. I just say one thing about the kind of list of 20 ways we identify ourselves. Mm-hmm. I've done some variant or version of that sometimes in my clinical work. And I will push now, again, if I'm doing individual therapy or even group therapy or something like that, yeah, it's a different context, right? So it's not, sure. It's not subjects in a research, study, whatever. But my pushback there is people will say, I'm a mom, I'm a daughter, I'm a sister, I'm a, right? And all these labels. Mm-hmm. And I will say, that's how you label yourself, or that's a part of how you identify, but that's not telling me about you specifically. Right? There's something about you as an individual specific, there's been plenty of people that are a wife, a daughter, a sister, but that's not saying about the core aspect. And so my question starts to become, that's a good process, again, in the context in which I'm working, but it's what are the things unique to you and only you on the planet before, during, and after, this time, your time on Earth.
Well, look, when someone goes to therapy, they're usually going to deal with something about their individual levels. Right? Yeah. You don't usually go to say, I'm here as a representative of Canada. I'm here to get some therapy as a Canadian. That would be a different process. Doesn't mean it's not actually a critical part of their identity.
Sure.
And there are tip-offs, right? So you can get a sense that something's part of identity if they, for example, feel threatened when somebody insults that group.
Right.
So someone makes fun of Canada and you're like, wait a second, no. That's a tip-off. Like there's some emotional investment here. They're reacting to that as if you'd said something about them personally as an individual. But you're right. In a therapeutic context, usually they're going to be there to talk about something more at the individual level of self than at a more collective level.
Yeah, no, that's right. And so I guess the one piece here is you talk about the pro-selves and pro-socials. Just tell us what you guys meant by that in the book and how you kind of mean that for this idea of the different identities.
Sure. Well, so that was a part of the book where we're talking about some specific research by some other people, David de Kremer and Mark van Voigt. And they did just a study that I find sort of illustrative of what's going on when a collective identity becomes salient to you and you start to operate in terms of it, which is that it can shift your motivations such that you'll start to pursue the interests of that identity. And they just ran a couple of nice studies that I've always liked where they divide people up essentially on the basis of a personality-like characteristic, which is called social value orientation. And the idea is that if you ask people, and these are fairly abstract questions, how they prefer resources to get divided up between themselves and other people, some people will say they would prefer resources get divided up in a fairly pro-social way, which is really, I'd like to try to maximize the gain of all of us. So I'll do well, but I want you to do well as well at the same time. And there's a couple of different ways you can do that, but that's broadly pro-social. And then there's other people who would say they'd like to do it in a more selfish kind of way. And that can also look different. Sometimes it's just, I don't care about your outcomes. So I'm just not interested. I'm going to do what's best for me. Good luck to you. And sometimes there are people who would actually prefer to maximize the difference between us. I want you to do worse and I want to do better. I want to really stand out. Both of those would get categorized as relatively pro-self. And so for half their participants in the study we talked about, they're then put in a resource allocation task in a group setting where they can decide whether or not to contribute to a group that they're part of or not. It's a social dilemma task. And unsurprisingly, the pro-socials are more generous and give more to the collective than do the pro-selves. Okay, no surprise there. But the other half of the participants, before they do this group task, have their collective identity made salient to them. And the collective identity in this case is that they're all students of the same university. So now you go into this group thinking of yourself as a student with a bunch of other students. Hey, we're all part of the same group. And what they then find is that the pro-socials essentially do what they always do, which is they're pretty pro-social, but the pro-selves suddenly become more generous. They suddenly start giving more to this group. And what's different is the identity they're operating in. And what we would suggest, and what they suggest in the paper, is that it's not that the pro-selves have become less selfish. It's the self shifted. Now the self is this group. If they were dividing resources between their group and another group, they would absolutely be selfish in favor of their own group. But since they're not, in this context, they're being generous toward their own people. So to us, it's just a nice illustration of this shifting of motives. And I think gets to your earlier question, which is really good, about like, what's the relationship between dispositional things, like your normal way of dividing up resources or your preference, and then identities that can come in and out of focus as you navigate the world.
Yeah, no, you. I'm glad you took the time to explain that, because it did pop out when I was reading the book, and I said, oh, there's a lot here, and it's very interesting to understand kind of these differences between dispositional versus situational kinds of things that can happen for many folks.
Totally, yeah.
So kind of leading from this is, many people have talked about this. When I was in grad school, I learned about this, concept, and we hear it a little bit more, I think, in mainstream now, is this in-group versus out-group kind of discussion that happens. And there's plenty of studies that have flirted around this or talked about certain things. There's talked about intergroup conflict or how people coalesce together when trying to work to solve a problem or against a common enemy. So how do you understand this idea of in-group versus out-group and kind of intergroup types of coalitions or many of these things in the context of how we understand how we're forming some of our identities when we're with a certain group?
So some of the research we talk quite a bit about in the book, and work that really inspired us, and a lot of the actual empirical work we've done ourselves, comes from a paradigm in social psychology called the minimal group studies, or the minimal group paradigm. And we personally think that these are among the most important experiments really ever run in psychology, although they're less well known than many other experiments. And in the minimal group studies, essentially what happens is people get divided into groups, or they get assigned to a group, a social category. It's usually very arbitrary in the sense that it's not a group they've ever heard of before. The criteria to belong to it are pretty meaningless. It can even just be the toss of a coin, to be honest. And they know that they're never going to meet anyone in the group. There's not really any outcomes at stake for them as an individual in these situations. And initially, these studies were sort of designed as a type of control condition. So the researchers were interested in intergroup relations and conflict between groups, which we know can be influenced by all kinds of things, right? So conflict over resources, stereotypes, long histories of conflict, old grudges, toxic leadership, like a million things could play in. And so they said, well, what we need is a control condition where we strip all that out. We have people in categories, but we don't have any reason for bias or discrimination. And then we can add stuff back in and see what happens. So we can add in a stereotype, or we can add in a conflict over a resource. But what they found is that simply putting people in these categories that are essentially meaningless still produce bias, despite there being no self-interest. It's not a zero-sum situation, so giving more to one group than another is not necessary. Nevertheless, people immediately start to like their own group more. They feel positively toward their own group versus the other one. And they, if given the opportunity, will discriminate in favor of that group. That is, they'll give more of a reward to their own group than they will to this outgroup. And again, it could be team A, team B. We've often used leopards and tigers, right? And they know it's random and they know it's meaningless, except it's not meaningless. It becomes meaningful psychologically. One thing that's, I think, important about these studies, though, is what you typically find. The normal pattern, before you started adding in things like zero-sum resource conflict, is that what people show is a pattern by which they prefer their own group, but they don't dislike the outgroup. So it's sometimes called in-group love, not out-group hate. So I think we're awesome and they're fine. Right. Like, whatever, they're fine. The feelings are pretty neutral toward the out-group for the most part, and more positive toward the in-group. Of course, in real life, that can still produce discrimination. It can still produce disparities if that causes you to favor your own group over another group. But it's not hate or strong dislike unless other things get added in, like conflict over resources or leadership that sort of vilifies the outgroup. You start doing that, then you get a much more toxic kind of pattern.
I wonder if you said that this study is very powerful and very important and influential. where do you see, I guess, some of the, and you guys talk about it in your own work and in the book, how do we, I'm sort of jumping ahead here, but how do we understand the applied implications of some of those things as we start to kind of map that onto various group identities or things that we have in our current society? I can add another layer onto that, which is, we have many people that are connected to a group through space and time because of social media and because of the connectivity of the world now, which is very different than just we're stationary in one place and we have a. So how do you think of the kind of applied implications of this?
Well, you can spin off applied or even not applied, just implications.
Sure.
In all
sure,
sorts of directions. I mean, so you can create, for example, novel identities, which at least momentarily will override existing identities. So this is some of the work that Jay's done in particular, and we've done it together over the years, where, for example, this was back in grad school, we brought people in, we put them into minimal groups, the leopards and the tigers, as I said. But in this case, they actually did learn something about other members of these groups. And one of the things they learned was that their team was mixed race. That these were all white participants, but they would see faces of in-group and out-group members, and they would discover that on each team, there's some white people and there's some black people. And what we found was that momentarily, at least, reduced or eliminated implicit bias, racial implicit bias. It changed brain activity. So when people perceived the faces of in-group out-group members in an fMRI scanner, they're now processing them in terms of whose team are they on? Are they a leopard or a tiger? Not in terms of the racial identity or the racial categorization of the face, which suggests, again, people had this readiness, right, to oh, here's a new opportunity to affiliate. Cool, let me try this out. And in that moment, that became the identity through which they perceived the world and they operated. Is that likely to persist beyond the lab? No, right? But it does suggest it's sort of a proof of concept that if you create new identities, you restructure the social world. And if you create new identities that are more stable than that, you might have longer term effects. And so in the book, we talk about a really cool study by, I think she's now incoming professor at Yale, Salma Musa, where she went to the Middle East in Iraq and created soccer teams with youths of Christian and Muslim religious beliefs, and found that on these mixed religion soccer teams, after having played a season together, there was a reduction in prejudice toward the other religious group and more willingness to interact. And this was particularly true for those teams that had been successful, that had done well in the soccer league. Again, is that going to last forever? Is it going to change the overall dynamic in the Middle East? No. Right. But it is, again, this idea that if you restructure environments and thereby restructure identities, people do in fact behave differently and do start to think differently about one another. So we see it as a starting point. There's much more work to be done to change the world, but it's taking into account how identities work as we think about the kind of interventions we need.
Yeah, I have two thoughts on this before I ask my next question, which is, so about sports. Sports does this a lot, right? I don't do sports psychology, but it seems that there's a goal in mind, right?
Sure.
A literal goal, like you're trying to make a goal or you're trying to score points. And if you, look, we'll just stay on soccer. Much of European football, European soccer, my audience will get what I mean. If you look at teams in Spain or the La Liga or Premier League or Bundesliga in Germany, Serie A in Italy, etc. You have players from all over the world that play on the same team, right? Of course, they're getting paid millions of dollars and they have many endorsements and whatever. But when those 22 players are on the pitch, right, 11 on each side, they don't have time to think about, well, this person's from this country, or this person has a darker skin or fairer skin than I do, or you're trying to win, and there's an incentive. There's an incentive of, hopefully their passion for the sport or, whatever. And it's a team, sport. And, obviously you get more money and all the good contracts and, whatever. But there's an incentive to say, yeah, I care less about many of these other things. And in fact, as over a season or whatever, there is so much of what happens on the pitch, what happens off the pitch, egos and personalities and all that stuff. But ostensibly, there's a collective goal of working towards something. You want an outcome. And that's a way in which that works. Kind of what you were saying with the example of the soccer teams in the Mideast. I wonder if this kind of applies to, we don't have to go too far on this, but just in general, how we think about some aspects of national pride, of, I'm from the United States, and you're from Canada, right? Canadian, right? So, I like my country and I love my country, and I'm more willing to be affiliated with my fellow citizens more so than I would with Canadians. Doesn't mean I hate Canadians. I love Canadians. They're great. I've always had good interaction with Canadians. But, if I have to pick, you can scale this down even further, right? Like, I'm going to care more about folks in my state or in my town or my city more so than I care about folks in Florida. Something wrong with Florida. Florida's great, but I don't live there. It's not, so you can do this at a big level on like a nation states kind of thing. And you can do it all the way down to like towns and cities and communities. Does this kind of expand out towards how we think about group identities and how we align or not align in group versus out group in terms of some of the nationalistic kinds of aspects?
Yeah, I mean, so for just the two of us, right, as an example, so you could make salient national identities. Say the Olympics are on, right? It's making salient to everybody in the world at the same point in time national identity. In which case, we're more likely to view each other as in-group and out-group member. We're not on the same team here. On the other hand, it could be a time when we're just national identity is not salient to us. We're doing a podcast that's about psychology, in which case we share an identity. And especially if this is like a psychology podcast and in the office next door, they're doing one on anthropology, right? Like our common identity as psychologists would be salient and we'd feel like in-group members, not like members of different groups. So that's a part of it. The other thing I think is that, and you were alluding to this, that these identities are almost always nested. So they're nested within bigger identities. This is particularly, true for political identities. So in the United States, you have Democrats and Republicans at war with one another, but they are nested within a broader identity, which is America. Right. And sometimes that becomes salient. Not often enough, I think. But for example, after 9/11 is a great example. The country's attacked, and after that time, for a period of time, political divisions really fell away, or at least were vastly reduced. George W. Bush had mediocre presidential ratings prior to 9/11. After 9/11, immediately, they went up to the highest level ever measured for any president
like
ever.
90% or something. It was crazy.
Right. And that wasn't just Republicans, right? Democrats too. Right? The country rallied around America as an identity, not Democrat Republican. Of course, that decayed, and you can talk about why, but it just highlights the fact that, again, identities shift, and as things come in and out of focus, it changes who we think we are and how we feel about each other. You can divide people that way, but you can also bring people together.
Yeah. So in terms of cooperation, right? You guys talk about this as in the book and aspects of this about cooperation of groups. Right. And so this is kind of what we're just speaking on, is there's a lot of research on cooperation, not only in humans, but also in other mammals and in other animals. So, Nicola Raihani has done work on cooperation in our social instinct, and McCullough has done this as well. And a bunch of other people have done a lot of more recent work on cooperation. So how do you understand cooperation in the way in which you guys are doing your particular research on social groups or group identity? They look at, everyone has like kind of a different angle of how they look at cooperation, but for how you guys are looking at it, how do you understand cooperation for group identity, and how do you factor in or out some of the darker sides of cooperation, namely people can cooperate as a group to do really awful things to another group, et cetera. So how do you think about cooperation in terms of group identity?
Yeah, so the way I tend to think about it is that the major problem underlying cooperation, right? The thing that either makes or breaks it is trust. who can I trust? Who can I trust, and who is going to be trustworthy, and who will trust me? Mm-hmm. And different species have evolved different mechanisms for coping with this problem, right? So the idea of kin selection, for example, clearly shows that cooperation in many species is more likely between more closely related kin, which makes sense from a genetic perspective. Human beings, and indeed some other species, have other mechanisms that have developed to create opportunities for cooperation. They don't guarantee it, but they help foster trust. And with humans and other species as well, one major mechanism is social networks, or not social media networks.
Yes.
Not Facebook, but what we used to mean by social network, which is people have stable or relatively stable patterns of interaction with each other. They learn about each other. They develop reputations, and on the basis of those reputations, you learn who's dependable, who's not dependable, who can I trust, who's a psychopath, right? And you all live, say, in a little village. You quickly learn who's a good cooperative partner, who's trustworthy and who's not. And generally speaking, the cooperative people do quite well, and the untrustworthy people often end up not doing very well because no one wants to interact with them anymore. So that's one mechanism, just either direct interaction, so you learn about each other, or indirect interaction, but it's based on other people's direct interactions. So it's reputational information. That's one of the functions of gossip.
Right, status, reputation. You're right.
What we would argue, and certainly we're not the only people to argue this, is that group-based identities are another mechanism. And this can allow for what's sometimes called impersonal trust, or trust without direct knowledge. So you don't know someone's reputation per se, you've never had direct interaction with them, but you both belong to the same social category, and you both know that you belong to the same social category. And as I've been saying, it's like people have a readiness not only to affiliate with social categories that they belong to, but also to extend trust within them. And so they pretty automatically, most of the time, will just feel a little more trustworthy and actually behave in a little more trustworthy way when it's an in-group member than an out-group member. And this is despite not knowing them or knowing anything about them. Again, this doesn't guarantee trust. It doesn't guarantee it will go well, but it's like setting the stage. It's presenting an opportunity. And as far as we can tell, humans are pretty resonant to that. And it's a second mechanism. It allows for broader networks of trust, or where you don't actually have to have direct network connections or know anyone's reputation, as long as you know you're part of the same group. We also develop other mechanisms. So institutions, legal systems, right? Contract law, like all of these are other ways that we foster trust. If there's contracts, that if I know you violate your contract, I can sue you, or you'll in some way be fined, or I know you have incentives to be trustworthy, even if we're not part of the same group, even if I don't know you, even if we hate each other, right? Like those are also mechanisms that human societies have developed, but we see groups as a part of that sort of matrix of options.
So I firmly agree with you. I think it's fascinating that you first thing you say is trust, because that makes sense. I think there's a lot you could probably unearth there about the element of trust and trying to understand cooperation. Sure. But I guess my one kind of pushback on this isn't that, so in a situation where I don't know somebody, or I don't know someone personally, they're not part of my family, they're not part of my network, whatever, and I'm relying on which group we're a part of as a preliminary thing. That just seems like a helpful heuristic, but also one that could go bad very quickly. If I'm just saying whatever group it is, hey, you know what, you and I, we're both males, so you know what's up, right? That could be very dangerous or very risky. Or we're both the same race, or whatever category you want to do, race, gender, whatever it is. That could be. I mean, there's some blind spots there. There's some pitfalls that could there. Is that a danger of maybe over relying on just the group kind of piece, and how do you correct for that?
Well, so, I mean, you're absolutely right. And so it means a few implications of that. One is that you should be attuned to, is the other person, first of all, do they recognize our common group membership, and are they invested in it, right? So we would suggest, and others have suggested, this is one of the reasons why people are concerned with group symbols. Why do religious people wear religious symbols? Why do sports fans wear caps with their logo on it? Why do people who went to university wear a shirt with the name of the university emblazoned on it, and so on? Right. They're signaling identities to the world. And I think we've all probably had this experience where you're somewhere in a novel context, somewhere maybe you're not normally, maybe you're traveling overseas and you bump into someone and you see that they're wearing a shirt from your university, or they're wearing for me, it'd be like a Blue Jays hat or something like that. It's like, hey, cool, one of us, right? In this, it's an immediate like, oh, we have something in common. And so we're attuned to that. And there's experiments which we discuss in the book, which show that people don't extend trust as readily, at least, to in-group members, if they know that the other person doesn't know they share a group membership. So it's not just I like you and that's why I'm doing it. It's I like you and I think I can trust you. But if I know you don't know we're part of the same group, then I can't trust you anymore because you just don't know it. It's not you're a bad person. We just don't have that shared awareness. But I think you're absolutely right. It can be exploited. So there is a class of fraud, for example, classified by the FBI, known as affinity fraud. And affinity frauds are con schemes that prey on shared identities, that go after people on the basis of some collective that people care about. So often these are grounded in religion. So a con artist shows up at the door of, say, an elderly couple, and they're selling some bogus scam, and they might be invoking, oh, I go to the same church as your daughter, or there's something in common, and that causes people to misplace their trust. So absolutely, it can be exploited, as can any sort of basis for trust.
Yeah, I like how you say that. Use the analogy. One time I was overseas somewhere, and I remember it was a couple of years ago, and I was in Europe. I don't remember where it was, maybe France, and I was out somewhere and I saw somebody that was wearing an Orioles hat, right? And I immediately lit up, right? Not because the Orioles are great. We're terrible, right? We're terrible. I think we're still last place in Major League Baseball. But that aside, I was like, who is this? It must be an American, right? It must be. And it wasn't American. It wasn't someone that was from Baltimore or from Maryland, but it was someone that, really liked the Orioles. But I went up to the person, right? And I said, hey, nice hat. Our team sucks this year and for the past 3 years, but, nice to see you still represent them. And I forgot where the person was from. We struck up a conversation, whatever. But it was a connector in a completely totally different context. I just don't go out to random people and say hi to them usually like that. Right. But that was the whole piece. There was something that connected us there. So that does make a lot of sense. There's a nominal amount of trust I'm going to put on, you come from, I mean, it could have been, right, someone gave him that for Christmas and he doesn't even know who the Orioles are. He's just a bird on but that was, on my mind, unlikely.
And it's not like you're going to hand over your life savings, but you did have that initial positivity, and you might be more likely to, if you were, say, in need of help, you might more likely to ask for help from that person.
Yeah. So one of the things that you guys do in the book, and I don't want to spend too much time on this because, I've had other podcast episodes on this, and, people talk about it. And so you guys give kind of the world tour. You give the global tour of all of the classic social psych studies I learned in grad school. Milgram's in there. Ash, everybody's in there. All you guys cite all the classic.
Not everybody.
Not every. So okay, many of them that we were cited were familiar. It's like, oh yeah, I remember reading about this. Sure. And there we have in psychology and social psychology, we have a replication crisis, which is basically many of these initial studies that we base a lot of these kind of groundbreaking studies. We haven't been able to replicate them or not replicate them as well. There's some ethical questions about some of them, and they definitely could have been done today. And so I guess, how do you feel specifically, which is a general question, but in social psych in particular, and psychology overall, that many of the studies we do or have done, we can't do them again and again and again and again and get kind of similar results to show like, hey, this is this has good consistency, right? This
Sure.
it has good reliability. That is a problem that most of us in the academia world, or that have been in grad school, are pretty well aware of this at this point, and it is a big problem. How do you just think about that in reference to some of the work that you guys have done, where you're citing some of these studies, but it's like, oh well, some of this stuff isn't is very, at the very least, unclear how much we can hang our hat on that. What are your just kind of thoughts about that piece?
Well, I think two broad thoughts. So first of all, we did talk about the replicability issue briefly at the beginning
Yes, you
of the
did.
book.
You did.
And we know what we're trying to do in this book is sort of illuminate principles of identity. And we believe the principles we are illuminating are pretty well founded. That, we're not hanging our hat on any single study when we're talking about a principle of identity. There's a large body of research, often from multiple angles, often not just in social psychology, which would speak to these dynamics. So there may well be the occasional study that doesn't prove replicable in the long run. That said, almost everything we cite from the recent past would be things with large samples and, that there's been replication and so on. So that's one piece of it. The other piece you're alluding to is we talk about some classics. Not every classic in social psychology. I think the three classics that we really do discuss are Ash's conformity experiments, Milgram's obedience experiments, and Zimbardo's Stanford prison experiment, which of course wasn't really an experiment.
Right.
And I think in each case, what we can still say and draw from today actually is different. They're not the same. We'll start with Ash. Ash demonstrated conformity, right? That put people in a situation where they're getting information about others' responses, even on a simple visual task, it changes their responses. Right. My personal view on that is that that is replicable, at least in the sense that we have a vast literature on conformity effects, that people have looked for conformity in almost every domain of life, from sexual behavior to drinking behavior to how we eat, to our politics, to our morality. It shows up again and again and again. I've done similar studies to Ash. It's not identical, but similar in my own lab. I've seen it with my own eyes. People conform when they see what other people are doing. So I have some degree of faith in his findings, in part because there's so many other related findings, and we could throw his studies out and still draw much the same conclusions. So that's one case. Milgram's a little bit different. Milgram, as you say, we couldn't replicate Milgram today, right? So he gets people essentially to obey an experimenter, seemingly shocking someone, either causing grievous bodily harm or maybe potentially even killing them. We couldn't put people in that situation where they believed themselves to be doing that today. And I think in the case of both Milgram and the Stanford prison experiment, which I'll talk about in a moment, I think you can hang your hat on something happened. People did, in fact, engage in certain sets of behaviors. But our understanding of what happened, or the psychology behind it, has shifted over time. And so we talk quite a bit in the book about, all right, well, if people in Milgram studies did do these things, right, they did comply, why? And I don't think it's a subtle question, in part because you can't rerun those studies today, but I think there's some clever attempts to shed some light on that. And that identity is part of the picture, that the choices people made in those studies seem to have something to do with, did they identify with the experimenter, and in which case they tended to comply, or did they identify with the learner, in which case they tended not to. And although it is worth noting, although we can't replicate Milgram, there's certainly other research that is perfectly ethical that shows that people are pretty compliant, and sometimes disturbingly so. So there's a great new book. I don't know if you've talked to her yet, but Vanessa Bones.
Yes. I just finished. I just finished the book. Yeah, I just finished the book.
Yeah, so she just published a book, came out same day as us, called "You Have More Influence Than You Think." It's an awesome book. Highly recommend it. A lot of her research is sort of Milgram-like. It's not asking people to do horrific things to other people, but it's showing the power of compliance. So there's one cool study she talks about where she asks people, imagine you go into a lab and the experimenter says, I need you to unlock your cell phone for me and then hand it to me. And I'm going to take it outside and have a look at some stuff. And they ask people, would a reasonable person hand over their phone? And everyone's like, no. And then they ask people, a different group of people, would you hand over your phone? And 75% of people say, no, I would absolutely not. Then they do it for real. Third group of participants are asked that question. 97% hand over their phone. They unlock it and hand it over, right? People are terribly bad at intuiting they'll do that, and they're actually very compliant. So you can raise questions about Milgram. They can't be run today. But there is a dynamic of compliance and obedience, and we think it has something to do with identity. Which brings us to the Stanford prison experiment, which I actually think is maybe the most interesting story of the three, because first of all, it wasn't an experiment, right? So Zimbardo creates a mock prison in the basement of the Stanford psychology department. He assigns people to be guards and some people to be prisoners. There's a sort of rocky start. The prisoners strike up a rebellion. The guards then crack down, and it becomes increasingly brutal. And after 6 or 7 days, right, he calls it off and wraps it up early. The message that psychology and the world took from the Stanford prison experiment for a long time was the inevitability of falling into a role. Right? You give people dark glasses and a nightclub, and they're going to become a brutal guard. You put people in you take away their underpants and you put them in like a smock and stick them in a cell. They'll become submissive, like a prisoner. It's inevitable. It's got this air of just like you fall into it, the extraordinary power of the situation. I personally think, at least, know that to be bunk. Like it didn't happen that way, and we know this in part because of transcripts and audio recordings from the actual experiment itself. And what's come to light is that the guards didn't spontaneously start to behave that way. They were led to do it. Zimbardo himself was the head prison guard. He gave instructions about how they should behave, that they should be aggressive and they should keep strong order and they should potentially strike fear into the prisoners. You can hear it online. And so a lot of people would say, okay, we can dismiss the whole thing. It was all fake. But our take, and this is also the take of other people like Alex Haslam and Steve Reicher, is hold on, something still happened. The guards still were brutal. We shouldn't dismiss that. It's just what we said happened isn't what happened. It wasn't inevitable. It wasn't automatic. It wasn't, you put people in a role, they inevitably do that. They were led there. That's the phenomenon. The head guard and the wardens, who were fellow experimenters, led the participants down the path toward that. And that itself is fascinating and really important, because it might have something to say about how groups end up engaging in really toxic, violent action against the members of outgroups. It's not inevitable, but you can get led there. And so that's why we talk about that study. So absolutely, the conclusion that was long drawn and that's in still today, unfortunately, in a lot of psych textbooks, is the wrong conclusion. But it doesn't mean there isn't something really important about that study that we should continue to talk about, because something happened. It's just, what was that thing?
Yeah, I like all of your answers. I mean, they seem very fair. They seem very very balanced. I think that that's important because I think if anyone is, takes a social psych course, or they, they read a social psych textbook, they're going to just kind of walk away. It almost feels like a history lesson at this point. Like, oh, here's all these studies, But I think what you're illuminating about some of the importance they still have in terms of the principles, I think is particularly instructive. So shifting to kind of some of the middle parts of the book, which is group polarization and some of the aspects of some of the negative pieces of group identity, which you've kind of alluded to. There's the big one, right? Political polarization. This is something that everybody talks about now. This is something that many people are researching. It's pretty, at least in the United States. I don't know how much it trickles into Canada. I know you guys just had an election, and there's some of that there too. So, how do we best understand political? You kind of alluded to it earlier, but how do we best understand political polarization in terms of group identity? Right? Is this just people attaching to a tribe or attaching to a group, and I'm on the blue team, you're on the red team, so I'm immediately going to hate you because of that, or is it that, or is it just there's a wanting to belong? So it's like they think like me, or they have the same principles, and so I need to belong to a group, and this one kind of makes emotional sense to me. What do you think about the impact of political polarization,
Right.
with group identity.
But one way to tackle that question is to sort of ask, well, what is polarization? And part of the answer, I would go back to something we talked about earlier, which is the distinction between in-group love and out-group hate, or liking for my own group versus dislike for the other group, and that they are often largely separable. As I said, they're not it's not inevitable. You have both.
Right.
And in fact, if you look at politics in America, say, for a long time, the relationship between Democrats and Republicans, or people on the left and the right, was of that in-group love, not out-group hate style.
Yeah.
So if you look at polling data from 1980, what you'd find is on both sides, people like their own party a lot, and they're neutral about the other party.
Right.
They're fine. I don't like them. I won't vote for them, but they're whatever. They're fine.
Right. I'm part of the GOP or the Republican Party. I voted for Ronald Reagan. I like him. He's great. Democrats, it's not my team.
Yeah.
I don't hate them.
Or leave them.
Whatever. Yeah. Tip O'Neill's, whatever. You know.
Right. And what's happened since then is that feelings to the in-group have not changed. What's changed is attitudes toward the out-group, so that they've become steadily more negative. And in a recent paper in Science that Jay was one of the authors of, they show, in fact, that those feelings of negativity toward the out-group are on average now stronger than the feelings of positivity toward the in-group. And that's a pretty toxic pattern, and that's one way to think about polarization. Another way to think about polarization is something more political sciencey in the way they often talk about it, which is it's a collapsing of identity into one dimension. So again, humans have all these multifaceted selves, right? That we're part of occupations and religions and charitable organizations, and there's all sorts of things going on in life. In a hyper-polarized society, all that nuance goes away, and it all gets collapsed into one thing and one thing only, which is, where do you stand politically? And if you know which church someone goes to, or where they work, or where they live, or what kind of job they do, you can be pretty sure you know what their politics are. And that's, in some ways, a place we're arriving at. And I think it's a huge loss for society, a huge loss for people. It's like a lot of the richness of life is getting wiped out in this like one-dimensional, which is super boring. Really,
it's terribly boring. It's terribly boring.
Terribly boring. But when you're living in that, it can become very consuming. And there's multiple contributors to it, for sure. And social scientists are really working hard to try to unpack all of it, and we don't understand it. But it's driven in part by elite behavior. So politicians have incentives to exacerbate conflict with the other side. It helps to mobilize supporters. Social media is almost certainly a contributor. As you said, right, you can find people no matter where they are, part of your group, and then you can gang up on the other side. Outrage flows really well on social media. People are incentivized to behave badly on social media because that's what gets likes and clicks and attention. So all of these things are contributing to polarization, and it seems to be particularly bad in the United States, but it's on the rise everywhere. The polarization's up in Canada, it's up in Germany. It's up in the UK, although it's a little different there. It's not about political parties per se, but the Brexit divide was extremely polarized and divisive. So it's a real problem in many places.
Yeah, I mean, I think you listed it there. There's a lot of incentives. Social media has an aspect to play on it, of course. I think because of the rapid piece and all that and how people are connected. But do you think people want to stay trapped in this kind of vortex of echo chambers, or do they is it just comfortable, or it's just harder to go and talk to a progressive liberal or a Trump supporter or whatever? People just get in their comfort zones. They just like hearing what people say and all that, or I don't know, how do you aside from the incentives, why do you think people choose, if you will, to kind of stay in that one kind of lane?
Yeah, I mean, I think part of it is exactly that. Comes back to trust, right? That who do you want to affiliate with? Who do you want to be around? You want to be around people you feel you can trust. And if dislike of the other side has risen to that level, there's going to be associated with that pretty strong feelings that you can't trust them. Now, it is worth noting that affective polarization, which is this kind of negative feeling, is very high. People who look at ideological polarization, which is how much do we actually disagree about real issues, policies, preferences, it's much smaller. Ordinary citizens, especially. Politicians are a bit different, but for ordinary citizens, we agree about a ton of stuff. We just don't know it. And we don't know it in part because we don't talk about it. And we don't talk about it because we're partly it feels bad. It feels like we can't trust each other. It can be very awkward. It can be tense. And the other part of it is we're increasingly segregated, right? Where people live has a huge association with politics now. And so if you live in a large urban area, bustling city, it's quite likely the vast majority of people you interact with are on the left. If you live out in the countryside, in a farming community, it's very likely almost everyone you interact with is on the right. And so people are increasingly not just on social media, but in real life, physical life, also in echo chamber-like kind of segregated settings. And it's hard to break out. I can just say this morning, just as an anecdote, I was walking my dog and I'm fairly lefty. And so I have a sign outside my house, which has a bunch of social justice-like slogans on it, and including Black Lives Matter. And one of my neighbors who I chat with occasionally, he walks his dog at the same time. He told me how much he hates my son. And he started to rant. And to me, at least, his rant was pretty conspiratorial. I think there were some things in there which don't sound quite right to me. And I think he probably picked them up from some dubious sources. But, he's my neighbor. And so I chatted with him for a bit. And then I ended up saying, next time you come by, I'm going to give you a copy of my book. He ranted at me. And then he concluded, and this is a positive thing, he concluded by saying, well, what do you think? And I said, well, if you want to know what I think, you can read it.
That's a nice question. Yeah, it's a nice question.
Yeah. And so I'm going to give him my book and we'll see where it goes. But I'd love him to read part of it and then have him around for a beer and chat. Because I think at the end of the day, we're not going to change each other's minds, but we might actually feel a little more positively toward each other.
Yeah, I agree. I talked about this recently, which was, to me, I have a very cynical viewpoint on this, which is, I think that how you create change or difference in ideas or beliefs is not the best logical, rational arguments at a mass level of scale, right? I just don't think that's very convincing for most people. They're going to find various ways to get outside that. I think it happens really at individual or very, very, very small group levels of ways of doing things. Like the interaction you were describing, right? The problem with that is that, it just doesn't scale, right? And so we just need a bunch of individuals doing that with other individuals. And, and outside of like war or like a national tragedy, there's very little things that pull people together now, which is sad. It's unfortunate, but because I kind of what you were saying earlier, most people do agree on many of the same things in terms of, certain issues. They just don't know it. And they're not talking about it. They're talking this kind of flattening of, everything's, distilled down to 1, 2, or 3 issues, which is not how the world works. So those issues are important, but there are confluence of many issues that are going on in each respective country and globally. But I do agree, that kind of your example, that there was, I don't know if you saw this in I don't know if it was New York Times or Washington Post, one of those big newspapers here in the US. They had like a kind of interactive where you could put in like your zip code and you could see your bubble, right? Which was cool. It was a really cool thing. And it was, I was seeing it, people were doing it and popping online and everyone was realizing like, oh man, holy shit, I just live in, an area where it's just all liberal, where it's just all all conservative. And, I think that's, downstream that happens. But I do think personally that we should push ourselves to where we live and the communities we inhabit should be a little bit more diverse in how people think about things on both sides. Personally, that's what I think. Some people would disagree and say, no, why? I want to live where I feel comfortable. I want to have my sign out in the front yard and not get, harassed by my neighbor because he thinks that, whatever. Some people might think that, and that's fine. But I think it's a little bit better if we're interacting not only with people that come from different backgrounds or different races or different, whatever, but also different points of view and different ideas. I think that that's probably a net positive, but maybe some people disagree. Okay, optimal distinctiveness is a concept that you talk about in the book. Tell us what this is, why it's important for group identity.
Sure.
Give us the
So optimal distinctiveness is a term and an idea coined actually by my postdoc advisor. Her name is Marilyn Brewer, and she's one of our intellectual heroes and expert on social identity. And one of the things she noticed was that people seem to have almost like competing motives when it comes to identity. On the one hand, we have a strong desire to belong and to fit in, something we've talked a bit about. At the same time, not too much. We also want to be distinct and feel unique and feel like something about us is special somehow, right? And that these are, to some extent, at odds with each other. And so she coined this term optimal distinctiveness, the idea being we're trying to find the optimum balance between them. We're looking for situations where we fit in, but we're also feeling somewhat distinct. And there's actually different ways you can solve that problem. Or find that balance. But one of them is to find groups that are tightly knit, are cohesive, so it's really satisfying that belonging need, but that stand out, that are themselves unique. So you often see this, for example, with teenagers, right? So you see a group of teenagers are all dressed to your eyes, your jaded adult eyes, as all the same, right? They're all punks or all goths or all whatever. And you say, oh, look at those conformist morons. Right. Go and talk to them. They'll be like, what are you talking about? We're not conformist. We're rebels. We stand out. They're optimally distinct, right? They're a little group. They're very cohesive. They absolutely are conformist within their little group. So there's very strong feelings of belonging, but their group itself stands out from the mainstream. And we and others have argued that this actually drives a lot of things. It drives the sort of why do people want to be fans of a band before it becomes popular? You want to be on the cutting edge, and then as soon as the band becomes super popular, you lose that optimal distinctiveness. Now you're just one of the crowd. It's not cool anymore.
You're on the bandwagon.
You're on the bandwagon, and then there's some sort of ironic sort of effects. So we say in the book, Apple, the computing company, has sort of been genius in its marketing over the years at creating optimal distinctiveness while becoming a world dominant brand, right? But a lot of their marketing over the years has been to sort of capture the sense that you're special. You're part of a real, almost cult-like computing community, at the same time as you're different from those boring old PC people, right? So their advertising campaigns have capitalized on this really brilliantly. The Think Different campaign, for example. You link yourself to iconoclastic thinkers throughout history is a genius attempt to make people feel optimally distinct while buying the product that like literally everyone else has.
Right. Yeah. It's interesting how that will happen for many different people in different groups, and it does seem to be laced in there this aspect of maybe implicitly some piece of authenticity, right? Which is I'm authentically a fan, right? Or I like this at the beginning before it was popular, and I've said that sometimes, right? About certain things, which is like you're trying to say like, well, if it's good, it's good. But like, I want you to know that I knew it was good authentically before everyone else knew it was good. So let me, I'm conforming to this thing. Like, it's interesting how certain, filmmakers or artists or, musicians can still kind of keep their like underground cred. Right. So a band I love is Deftones. They're very, they're a popular alternative band. There's like, for some people, it's like that people that know them, it's like, oh yeah, it's super popular. But there's an element to them where there's a lot of people that still don't know who they are, and they're quite old now. I mean, they're like 30 years old now. But it's the same thing like with Depeche Mode, right? Like there's a handful of people that know who Depeche Mode is, but there's still people. If I talk to people that grew up in the 80s, they'll be like, yeah, I've heard that one song. I don't know who that is. So there's this weird thing where sometimes it really depends on the group or circle you're in sometimes, which is like, oh yeah, everyone knows who that is, whatever, or other people don't. And it's like, oh, okay. And so I think the same thing, kind of what you're saying with Apple is like, oh yeah, like, there is a cult of Apple, but then there is this element of I think the thing that maybe sets it apart is, in my opinion, is that it's one of those pieces of, yes, you're part of a group, but we're going to make technology a more emotional kind of experience that you're having.
Mm-hmm.
Like I'm not getting that when I open up a PC or I download, Microsoft Office Suite, right? But when I'm getting that new iOS download, I'm like, oh my goodness, this is such an interactive, affective thing. And they've been writing that for
They've been writing it
decades.
It's very clever.
It's very good, even down to like, when you get the packaging out, right? And it's just so like, it's it's an aha moment. I don't feel that way when I long time ago when I had bought a HP or something. I was just like, oh yeah, like this. I don't know. There's some thought put into it, but again, it is a kind of interesting thing where it's like, yeah, everybody has an iPhone, right? Everyone has a MacBook, whatever. Okay, so just kind of towards the last part of the book here is, towards the end, you're talking about some of what I took as, how do we have a healthy group identity, right? How do we foster this? There's some negatives which we talked about. We talked about what it is and some of the negatives, but then kind of how do we have? It's obviously important. It's obviously, I would say, some element of that we're as humans groupish and so inherent for our evolutionary history. And so having a healthy group identity, I think, is important. I really liked the section in the book on dissent, really, which I think comes out of, again, the literature of the ways to combat groupthink is to have someone that plays devil's advocate, someone that has dissent, and obviously in a nice way. How do we have dissent in a healthy and respectful way for other people within our group and for other groups? And would there be any moments where dissent wouldn't be acceptable or maybe advantageous?
Right. So I've been really interested in dissent for quite a long time now. And one of the arguments we make, and it's based on research we've conducted, is that a lot of dissent is motivated by identity, which is to say that it's when people have taken on a group identity, and it's because so often we're conforming to the norms of our groups, especially if we like the norms. But it can also drive dissent. It can cause people to speak out if they think that our group is doing something harmful or unproductive or problematic. And again, the reason is I care. And that having a strong identity and seeing things my own way or seeing things differently are not opposed to each other. And so we find in many cases that seems to be what happens. Strong identifiers are ordinarily more conformist, but if they see something wrong with the group, they actually might be more dissenting. Whereas the weak identifiers, they're not as concerned for the group. If they have a problem with the group and the group norms, the easiest thing is to disengage. Like, I'll go find another job, or I'll just pull back. Like, and the reason for that, or a big reason for that, is that dissent is often risky. Right. Yeah. It doesn't buy you friends necessarily. Your boss might not be happy about it. Like, there's lots of reasons people struggle to stand out or speak up. And so if you want healthy groups, especially groups that can adapt to changing circumstances, groups that can innovate, groups where people are free to dissent, that's one of the things I think group members themselves and leaders of groups need to be really attentive to, which is, what are we doing with those incentives? Like, what are we incentivizing here? Do we jump down people's throats if they dare speak out, if they say anything different? Or are we receptive to it? Like, how we react to people when they dissent will determine whether people in the future are likely to do it or not. And that goes for leaders. And there's a lot of attention in organizational literature about like creating psychologically safe workspaces, for example, which is really spaces people can speak freely without too much worry about it. But we point out in the book, peers matter just as much, sometimes more. Like, the peers are your friends, and being rejected by them can actually be just as hurtful or harmful to you as being disliked by your boss. And peers are often also quite likely to enforce norms rigidly and not like it when people speak out, and not like what we call sort of righteous rebels. And so it's incumbent on all of us in groups, if we want the opportunity tomorrow to dissent and speak our mind, we should be kind to those who do it today, because we're establishing a different kind of what we would think is a healthier norm. And going back to the Solomon Asch conformity studies, I think one of the coolest findings in any of that work was a version of the study where people are sitting in this room, There's a whole bunch of Confederates all giving the wrong answer, and it's causing the real participants to go along with the crowd at least sometimes and give the wrong answer themselves. But there's one version of the study where among those people giving wrong answers, there's a dissenter. And as soon as there was one dissenter, there was almost never any conformity by the real participants. The real participants almost never gave the wrong answer then, because that dissenter had broken the seal. They'd like released the pressure. They'd allowed for the possibility of dissent. And what was super cool about that experiment, or that version of the experiment, is that the dissenter didn't even have to be right. They could give another wrong answer. But if it was different than the crowd, it freed up the participants to give the right answer. And I think there's a hugely valuable lesson there, which is that in groups that we're part of, there's value to dissent even when it's wrong, right? That it gets the rest of us thinking. And in fact, that's pretty consistent with the literature on dissent, is that one of the virtues of it isn't that it necessarily persuades people, it's that it gets them thinking. And if they're thinking, they're more likely to be creative and innovative and come to the right answer themselves.
Yeah. No, that's wonderful. Last question I have is what are the future? What's the future of identities? How do we see them evolving as in a digital age, and just in general as we keep learning more about science and humans and many other things on the planet? And how do we have healthy group identity, and how do we charge forward in a way that is more creative and more productive than just contrarian or trying to tear things down? How do you see the future, and how do we get there?
Yeah, so the end of the book we have a chapter called "The Future of Identity." I'm not sure it answers any of the great questions you just asked. I mean, so Mark Twain, and I'm paraphrasing, I won't get this quite right, once said something like, prediction is hard, especially when it's about the future. So we're cautious about that. I mean, I think human psychology is human psychology, that technological innovations will continue and will probably continue to occur even more rapidly than in the past. And it can sometimes leave the human mind a bit behind in the dust, right? And we struggle to adapt. I think we're seeing this, we're living it right now in the era of social media. But this is not the first time we've been through something like this. Revolutionary technological change has happened again and again throughout human history. And we do eventually figure out better norms and better practices and ways to create stability and capitalize on the good and minimize the bad. This happened after the printing press. This happened after newspapers have become widespread. Spread of disinformation early on in the news media, the traditional news media, it was rife. And then the press slowly developed ethical standards and press guilds and other means of regulation. And the way in which we adapt to that is we develop institutions. We get together and we develop structures that create the right incentives, incentives that produce better patterns rather than negative ones. Social media is really only 15 years old. And a lot of experts would say it's another 30 years out before we figure out how to handle it, which is worrisome because of what's happening.
It is, but that sounds about right, though. I mean, it's it's still in its infancy. We have to, we're definitely gonna keep breaking a few eggs, and unfortunately, it's really frustrating. But I mean,
Right. So with regard to the future of identity, at the end of the book, we tackle very briefly 3 things we think are pressing issues for the future and that identity will play some part in, which is rising inequality, climate change, and democracy. And I think there's identity implications in all cases. Inequality, can groups of people come together around a set of common goals to create better equality in many of the world's economies, where we're seeing rising levels of inequality to levels that, at least historically, start to look unsustainable. And in the case of climate change, again, it's a massive collective action problem. How do you get the world's community of all these different nations to work together to mitigate against maybe the worst possibilities of climate change? Because it looks like we're going to incur some pretty bad outcomes regardless at this point. And again, we think that's going to have something to do with building a broader coalition and a broader identity. And then with regard to democracy, I think politics is supposed to be about conflict, right? That's what politics is. But it's meant to be within a set of institutions, or it works well without violence.
Yes.
And there's a set of institutions that guide that conflict, that channel it toward compromise and productive ends. Mm-hmm. And the threats to democracy we're seeing, or democratic backsliding, are when political parties decide they're not comfortable or they no longer are interested in losing. Mm-hmm. And they'll subvert the system and the institutions in order to maintain power. Mm-hmm. And to prevent that, I think we need a coalition on the other side that they may disagree about many aspects of policy, but they are in agreement that the institutions of democracy are worth saving and indeed worth strengthening. And that itself will be an issue of identity. Can they form a collective identity despite their differences, to fight for this most cherished part of our society?
Yeah, no, I totally agree. Those are big challenges, and I follow the philosophy of Nietzsche here, which is we have to live a very active life, mm-hmm. And not a passive one. And we only, as far as we know, only have one life, and we should try our best to be as active as we can. I think for positive ways for mm-hmm. ourselves and for people close to us and people that aren't close to us. And so hopefully we can really march forward there. Dominic, this was fantastic.
Thanks for having me. It's been fun.
Of course. Yeah. The book is The Power of Us: Harnessing Our Shared Identities to Improve Performance, Increase Cooperation, and Promote Social Harmony. Where can people find you? And Jay, where can they get the book? Look at your research, all that good stuff?
The book is widely available at this point through Amazon, Barnes & Noble, any fine bookseller. And we have a website, thepowerofus.online. We can find out more information about the book. We both have active Twitter accounts. Feel free to look us up. And we also have a weekly newsletter, for the moment weekly anyway, that we publish on Substack. There's The Power of Us on Substack, so you can find us there as well. No,
it's great. Again, thank you for coming on. This was such a blast. I really enjoyed this conversation, and I think a lot of people will too. So big thanks to you for doing it.
No, thank you.
All right, thanks.